After almost a decade in remission, I learned 3 years ago that my leukemia was back. What people often say in circumstances like these is you have to live every day as if it's your last. I have come to believe that this is terrible advice. It's a lot of pressure to try to make everything meaningful, to carpe diem the crap out of every single moment. So I've had to shift to a gentler mindset, which is trying to live every day as if it's my first.
From the news team at LinkedIn, I'm Jessi Hempel, and this is Hello Monday. It's our show about work on our own terms. Today's episode is for anyone who is wrestling with the question that is so central to me this spring. How do we live well with all of this uncertainty? And not just well, but with creativity, with curiosity, with care. Our guest is Suleika Jaouad, and you may know of Suleika's work from her best-selling memoir, Between Two Kingdoms, which came out during the pandemic. Or you might have seen the Oscar-nominated documentary, American Symphony. It chronicled the incredible, loving relationship between Suleika and her husband, the musician Jon Batiste. But me, I've been around a while, and so I remember back in 2012 when Suleika began a column for the New York Times. She was so young then, really just out of college, and she was grappling with her first leukemia diagnosis. And yet, this column, it was called Life Interrupted, and it was so universal. She wrote with such clear eyes and such wisdom about uncertainty and how to live well with it. This spring, Suleika is out with yet another new book, and folks, it is one of my favorite books this year. It is called The Book of Alchemy, a creative practice for an inspired life. And in it, she collects her own stories, but also 100 essays and writing prompts from her friends, many of which are people you've heard of, like Elizabeth Gilbert and Pico Iyer and Danny Shapiro. And here's what I have to tell you. This book invites us to step up and play along. Through journaling, art making, using our imagination, she invites us to metabolize our grief, to love more deeply, and to experience joy more fully. Okay, let's get into it. Here's Suleika.
I spent that first summer in the hospital, 6 weeks in the hospital in isolation, not reading Dostoevsky or whatever it was that I was planning to do, but being incredibly depressed and watching my friends, going off to graduate school and getting married and starting their careers and all the other big and small milestones of young adulthood. And I not only felt stuck, I honestly felt like no one, because I didn't have anything impressive to report on social media. I didn't have anything to say in response to the question that we ask ourselves when we first meet, what do you do? I was sick. I hadn't chosen this illness. And I was stuck in a hospital room. And instead of reading, through the rest of the Western Canyon, I was attempting to set the world record for the number of Grey's Anatomy episodes watched consecutively.
And little did you know you would not actually be able to do that because they're still making Grey's Anatomy episodes.
That's unbelievable.
But yes.
And so for me, it was a real scales falling from the eyes moment. And I think a realization of how much of my identity and my sense of self-worth was wrapped up in my productivity, and what, the journalist David Brooks describes as our resume virtues, the attributes that you would list on your CV that make you attractive in the modern marketplace, as opposed to our eulogy virtues, the traits that were lauded for often long after we're gone. Were we generous? Were we kind? Were we humble? Were we brave? And so without all of those external markers of success, I really had to have a major reckoning about what was actually important to me. And I think, there's a silver lining to confronting your mortality at that age. For me, it was a real rerouting of my priorities. I had about a few, 1 or 2 hours a day where I felt well enough to do something. And so what that meant was that I had to get really specific about who I wanted to see and what I wanted to do within those 1 or 2 hours. And that proved actually to be a really clarifying exercise.
It was a constraint you never would have asked for that showed you something,
Yeah.
right? So in your book, your beautiful book with an incredible cover, the Book of Alchemy, you examine creativity from every direction. And I come away personally with this new idea for how to define creativity, which is ultimately, I think you show us in this book how creativity is a path to connection and a guard against the experience of uncertainty. And I'm wondering at what point you embraced that creative process early on.
So, my belief is that we are all deeply creative. Navigating the modern world and workplace requires creativity. Have a fight with your husband, that requires its own kind of creativity. Cooking is creative. Everything that we do is creative. And as children, we have access to that creativity in such an organic, free-flowing way. We play, we experiment, we tap into our imaginations, we allow ourselves to dance or to make believe or to do whatever it is that we do without worrying about being good at it or bad at it or having any sense of there needing to be an outcome. And as we get older, that self-consciousness creeps in, that sense of comparison, that feeling that if you're going to do something, it has to count for something. You have to have something to show for it. And so, for me at 22, back in that hospital room where I had no idea what to do with myself, where I couldn't have a typical job, I began to think about what I might do within the four walls of that hospital room, and to understand that in order to survive this experience, and I don't mean medically, but I mean just as a human being, and spiritually and emotionally, that I was going to need more to get me through. And so a friend came up with the idea of a 100-day project. The premise was really simple. We were each going to do one creative act a day for 100 days. And I decided that for my project, I was going to journal, because journaling is not polished writing. It's not, I'm penning a masterpiece writing. It's something you do entirely for yourself. And so that's what I did, because I felt that I had no idea who I was. I had lost that connection to myself. I had so many questions and very few answers, and I needed a space where I could show up as my most unedited, unvarnished self. And so that's what I did. And in the course of keeping that daily journal, I began to tap into that mystical, divine trait that we have such organic access to as children, which is creativity. And that 100-day project truly changed my life. It became the source material for so much. It contained the seeds of what would actually become my career. But more than that, as I began to feel a connection to myself through that writing, especially at a time where I could barely recognize myself in the mirror, I found that it was easier for me to be vulnerable with my friends and family, to share what I was feeling and to feel connected to them.
So much of that, as you describe, sounds to me like the way in which, when we know ourselves deeply, we are free or more enabled to know others well. And it sounds like you learned this by experience. And I'm curious, you have spoken to so many people about this work over the course of your career and through your incredible project during the pandemic. Do you think this is something that people can learn, say, by reading your book and trying real hard? Or is this an experience that you have to intuit through your own personal
Mm.
experience?
So I do believe that cultivating a creative practice and reaping its benefits is something learned. It's something we have in us innately, but because we lose that connection to it, we have to learn how to get back to that place. And so, my hope with this book is that it offers a guide and an encouragement for how to do that. Because, we know things like meditation or journaling are good for us. There's an abundance of research that has proven the benefits of journaling. But I don't know about you, but I think, so many of us have the experience of buying a beautiful journal with the intention of writing our way through it. And you fill out a page or two and leave the rest blank. And then you have to buy a new journal because that journal is ruined and is proof of your
Totally
failure
ruined.
to actually see it through. So as self-evident as something like journaling may appear, I've found that in order to really get to the richness of what it has to offer, it does require some guidance. And in the moments when I've needed it most is when I've resisted it most, because I think sometimes when you're stuck in your life, you get stuck in the same thought loops. So it can be hard to feel like you're getting somewhere interesting, or like you're not just writing rant after rant about, your ex or your boss or whomever it is. And so I've found that I need to be prompted. I need the container of 100 days or 10 days or 30 days in order to know what I'm working toward. And much like going to the gym, there may be resistance, there may be discomfort, but it's only in exercising that muscle with consistency that you start to see its rewards.
I'll say, Suleika, that this was a big unlock for me, that I'm a big fan of morning pages. Whenever I'm trying to work out anything in my life, I return to them. Our listeners don't need to hear them defined because I talk about them on the show in a regular cadence. But the thing about morning pages where I get kind of stuck is that I do tend to revisit the same patterns, belief patterns. I write down the things I already know to be true rather than imagining what could be true. And I think about the constraint of a prompt as an invitation to just think about something differently, not to solve that thing, but to just be in a different pattern of thinking.
I had so many questions about pretty much every aspect of my life. I was in a relationship and we were trying to figure out what that looked like for us and if there was going to be a future. I was, thinking about my next steps professionally. I was wanting to put down roots, but not sure where or how to make that happen. And the future felt like a scary place because it was so full of unknown. And so the prompt was this. It was to write a dream day 5 years out in the future, in the present tense, which is really important, and to write through your whole day from the moment you wake up until you go to sleep. And when I heard this, I was like, sounds a little hokey. I don't know if I want to do that. Everything about that feels a little scary. But I did it because I had a lot of things to figure out, and I really respected this friend and trusted her. And so every single day I started writing this prompt, and I would write about who I woke up next to, which was my then boyfriend, now husband. I would write about my 2 dogs, one of which I already had, one that I had yet to meet. But what I really found myself writing about was my future home. I grew up on the move a lot as a kid, and had a kind of nomadic period of time in my 20s. And more than anything, I was craving stability. All I wanted was one key and a place to call my own. And I never owned a home before. And so I started writing about my dream house in as much detail as I could. So I'd walk myself through my day, I'd have my cup of coffee in my kitchen, which it turned out was, this dream tiny little farmhouse with wide plank floors. I would write about my end of day ritual was taking a bath in the clawfoot tub. I'd write about this little cabin in the backyard that functioned as my office, and walking in the woods, et cetera, et cetera. So fast forward many months later, when I was actually in a position to try to buy a home, and I toured, I don't know, maybe 60 different properties. This is in rural Delaware River Valley. And one day I arrived at this house, and lo and behold, as soon as I pulled into the driveway, I knew it was it. The very first thing I saw was a tiny garden shed that had been converted into an office. It didn't have heat, but it did have a burning wood stove, which felt very romantic to me. I walked into the main house, cue wide plank floors, cue clawfoot bathtub, and I made a handshake deal right there on the spot with the seller. And a month later, I'd moved in. And what do you know? My brother asked me if I could take care of his dog who had gone blind and was having a hard time in the city. And there she was, my second dog, my perfect dream day in the life. And so, I'm not someone who believes in manifesting. I don't think this was an act of manifesting, but what that journaling exercise did was that it shifted me out of my fear of the unknown into a place of daydreaming and fantasizing about what could be. And it allowed me to get specific about what I wanted, so that when I saw it, I knew, and I was immediately clear that it was the right thing for me. And so, various prompts, this one especially, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that, this approach to journaling for me has been life-altering and even life-saving in moments. I really credit it to every good thing that I have.
Now, I have to say, I love that you call out manifesting, and I see sort of an eyebrow raise as you say the word. It would be easy to call that magic. And what you're pointing to, I think, is so critical, which is, call it whatever you want. Something about the structure of the practice allowed you to lift the veil of fear and more broadly think about what is possible. Now, you live in a very uncertain body-time world. We all do. Yours is very known. I'm curious how you lift that veil of fear day to day in your life.
So after almost a decade in remission, I learned 3 years ago that my leukemia was back. And I learned last summer that it had returned a third time. So when you hear that you have cancer for the third time, it is really easy to go to a place of doom. And the what ifs are just all consuming. And so I have really struggled with how to swim in that ocean of uncertainty without feeling like I'm drowning in it. And I know at this particular moment, for everyone, there's so much uncertainty globally, financially, otherwise. And it is so hard to know how to find, to paraphrase the poet T.S. Eliot, that still point in the spinning world. And so, I remember an early conversation I had with my oncologist as I was navigating these recurrences. And I said, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to make plans without the fear that they'll be hijacked by my illness. I don't know how to dream big and to imagine myself in the future when I don't know if I'm going to get to exist in the future. I don't know how to calm myself in the days leading up to, whatever biopsy is around the corner. I just don't know how to do this, and I don't want to be eaten up with anxiety all the time. And so he said to me what people often say in circumstances like these, which is you have to live every day as if it's your last. Now, I have come to believe that this is terrible advice. It's a lot of pressure to try to make everything meaningful, to carpe diem the crap out of every single moment. And so I've had to shift to a gentler mindset, which is trying to live every day as if it's my first, and waking up with that sense of curiosity and playfulness and wonder and creativity that children have so naturally. And where that begins for me is in the journal.
There's one more topic I want to make sure that we explore in our time together, because it was a wonderful surprise. You wrote about love, and I was excited about that essay because your husband is somebody that I know and love the work of, the artist Jean-Baptiste. I got to see the incredible documentary, American Symphony, last year that at its heart chronicled a love. And he wasn't the subject of that essay. And in fact, that essay asked me to rethink critically my notion of romantic love and ask a broader question about love. And I wanted to ask you to tell us the story of Anjali and what she taught you.
Thank you for that. Romantic love is a prominent subject in my journals. If I dedicated the amount of time I'd spent writing about crushes and dating angst to learning languages, I would be a polyglot by now. But another thing that came up were friendships. And, I don't know that we have the same kind of language for understanding our friendships and navigating the challenges that arise in friendship, and thinking through how we want to show up for one another. And so for me, when I got sick, it was a rude awakening that, the people I spent time with were not necessarily the ones who were showing up in my hospital room as my hair was falling out. And as much as the temptation might be to point the finger at those friends and to say they were bad friends, really, when I think about it now, I hadn't cultivated the sort of deep friendships that could hold that kind of life interruption. I didn't know how to cultivate those kinds of friendships. And so I became a student of community, of people who loved well and who had a depth of love in their relationships and in the people they surrounded themselves with that I wanted for myself. And so Anjali was a young woman I met in the waiting room while I was recovering from my bone marrow transplant. She was also an immigrant. She had the same disease as me, and she had also gone through a bone marrow transplant. But the key difference between us was that she was estranged from her family, and that her brother had never returned her phone call to be a donor, whereas my brother had immediately stepped up to the plate and was grateful for the opportunity to save my life. And so to make a long story short, Anjali learned that her transplant had not worked, and that she had a couple of months to live. And because she didn't have family, and because she was someone who hadn't really had the time to cultivate chosen family, it became clear to me that there wasn't a person in her life who was going to consistently be able to be with her and to see her through to the end. And that felt unconscionable to me. And it was really, honestly, humbling as someone, who did have family, maybe even took that for granted. The idea that, the people who are at least tied to you by blood are going to show up. And so I, even though I was still in treatment, became her caregiver. And it was one of, the hardest experiences of my life and truly one of the greatest privileges, to get to be there with her in the final weeks and days of her life. She was someone who was really tough, and the world had taught her to be tough and had trained her to expect disappointment. And her big fear, of course, was that she was going to die alone. In the last days of her life, when we were in this hospice unit at Bellevue, when she realized she was not going to be alone, I got to meet a different version of her, a softened version, an unarmored version of her, for the very first time. And every couple of hours, she would open her eyes and look around to make sure I was still there and reach for my hand. And she'd tell me she loved me. And I tell her I loved her, which was not something we had ever done before. And her last word to me was love. She died on Valentine's Day. And, as devastating as that was, I felt such an immense sense of peace because she felt such an immense sense of peace, because she wasn't alone in the end. She gave me the gift of feeling connected, but more than that, she gave me the opportunity to embody the kind of friendship I never had, but that I wanted to cultivate more of. I think love really is at the center of what it means for me to live a successful life, which is to say a life where I feel most connected and alive.
That was Suleika Jaouad. Her new book is The Book of Alchemy. Run, don't walk to your nearest bookstore to get it. Now, folks, there is, as usual, so much I'm taking away from this conversation. And this time around, there's also something I'm doing. I am doing Suleika's 100-day practice, her journaling practice. I'm 8 days in, and let me tell you how it's going so far. I phoned it in a couple of times. In fact, on day 3, I didn't wake up in enough time that I could get it in before the kids woke up. And so around 4:30 in the afternoon, I turned on Gabby's dollhouse and locked myself in the bathroom for 15 minutes. It's all it took, really, 15 minutes. And here's the thing, it doesn't actually matter if you phone it in occasionally. The constraints, and there are 3 prominent constraints, right? The first is do it every day for 100 days. The second is read a short passage. And the third is respond to the prompts. They exist for everything that they unleash, not because you need to conform to them. What I've discovered already 8 days in is that there were things rolling around in my brain I hadn't paid any attention to, things that unlock new conversations and new avenues for me. I'm really excited to see what happens from here. I hope you'll consider doing it too, and tell us about it. Finally, folks, I want to talk to you about this idea of alchemy. Suleika titles her book, The Book of Alchemy. And when she's talking about this, she's not actually talking about turning everything around us into gold, at least not in the physical sense. She is talking about the inner work of transformation that comes when we turn toward the grief and uncertainty and illness and all the muck of life, and we put it through our massive, creative, artistic hearts and brains and transform it into connection, expression, insight, and joy. Y'all, it's about making something sacred out of this mess. That is what I want you to take away from today's conversation. We're going to get into all of this week on Office Hours, Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern. As usual, our senior producer, Sarah Storm, and I will go live on the LinkedIn news page. If you're looking for us and you can't find us, you can always check the show notes because we keep a link there. And if this episode landed with you, and I hope it did, I hope you'll take this moment right now to text it to a friend. And yes, I said text. I'm Jessi Hempel, and this is Hello Monday. Thanks for joining me in the studio today. I'll be right back here next week.